The first thing you notice when you're abandoned is the quiet. Not silence. No silence has a kind of purity to it. This is more like a vacuum, where the sounds of the world keep moving around you, but none of it lands. The breeze still plays with the leaves, engines still rumble down the road. Footsteps echo on the sidewalk. But when you're sitting on a public bench with an old handbag, 2 plastic bags of clothes, and exactly $8 in your sweater pocket, everything seems to glide past you like you're a ghost in your own story. That day, the light hit the pavement with a strange cruelty. The kind of light that makes you squint, even though it's not hot, just bright in all the wrong ways. I remember looking down at my hands, tracing the sunspots and the creases. My wedding band still rested on my finger, a circle that had meant something once. Now it just felt like a closed loop, like a door that had quietly shut behind me. A week earlier, I'd been recovering in a recliner chair, my legs still weak from the fall I had in the kitchen. I slipped while boiling water for tea. My pride hurt more than the bones. A fractured hip at 71 isn't a small thing, though. My son Kwang had insisted I move in with him and his wife Lynn until I got back on my feet. At the time, it felt like mercy. Now it felt like misdirection. It's a strange alchemy, how care turns into control. At first, Lynn fluttered around like a nurse with a checklist. Did I take my pills? Was I keeping off the stairs? Did I need a new prescription? I'd smile and thank her. I truly meant it in the beginning. But after a few weeks, I stopped getting my mail. My pension didn't show up in my account when I asked. She said the bank had updated the process and they were handling it now more efficient this way. When I asked to see the statements, Kwang would laugh and say, "Ma, you don't need to worry about that anymore. You just focus on getting better." It sounds harmless, doesn't it? Gentle even. But there's a tone people use when they are talking past you, not to you. It's the sound of your autonomy being erased one syllable at a time. The real turning point came 3 nights before they left me there. I had just made a small joke at dinner, something about how their dog Peanut had better medical insurance than I did. Lynn's face froze mid-chew. Kwang stared at his plate. Later I heard her whispering in their bedroom voice, sharp as a needle. The words weren't clear, but the tone was. The next morning my tea was cold. There were no pleasantries. And then a ride in the car. No explanation, no bags, no goodbye. Just a final sentence. "We'll come back for you after we sort some things out." Then the engine pulled away and I sat on that bench, just me, my aching hip, and those $8 damn. But let me tell you something they didn't count on. They didn't count on me remembering who I was. I wasn't always a mother or a wife, or a fragile old lady who needed help opening jars. I had once been a teacher, 32 years in the same school, shaping minds, calming storms, managing 30 children in one room, while still finding time to listen when one of them whispered about nightmares or hungry bellies. I buried my husband without a penny from anyone, held Kwang through chickenpox adolescence and a rebellious university phase where he said I was too traditional. I survived war, hunger, quiet betrayals. So no, I would not be erased by this. I used that $8 to buy 2 things: a cup of warm pho from a small corner vendor who looked at me with pity, and a bus fare to the one place that hadn't changed since I was young, the small temple in Pun Huan, where I once used to go on my lunch breaks just to breathe. The monk there didn't ask questions, just offered me tea and a mat to rest on. A week later, Lynn texted me. Only a single sentence. "Stop being so dramatic." And that strangely was when something inside me snapped, not in pain but in clarity. That line wasn't about me. It was about her need for the story to stay tidy, for the image to remain intact. The dutiful daughter-in-law, the helpful son. They wanted me to play the role they wrote for me. But I had burned that script. I didn't respond to Lynn's message right away. I stared at it for a while, the screen's glow cold in my palm. Stop being so dramatic. The audacity of it, as if being left on the street like an old suitcase, was a matter of overreaction, of misplaced emotion. As if dignity were something optional for the elderly, like dessert after dinner. I deleted the message. I sipped the monk's tea, jasmine and earthy, and let the warmth settle in my chest. The temple was quiet. A few women heads, bowed, swept the courtyard with palm brooms. Their rhythm was meditative. I watched them, and something in their calm repetition steadied me. I wasn't sure how long I would stay, a few days, a few weeks. I wasn't yet planning beyond the present. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going back. The monks offered me simple meals, and I helped clean in exchange, sweeping leaves, folding laundry, sorting rice. My hip ached, yes, but movement helped. The work didn't demand explanations or smiles. It asked only presence. And slowly I began to feel the pulse of life return to me, not the bustling, hurrying kind, but something deeper rooted. Like a tree rediscovering the feel of wind in its branches. One afternoon I asked the head monk if I could use the old computer in the back office. He didn't ask why. I think he understood the quiet urgency in my voice. I reset my online banking password. It took 4 tries and a call to a grumpy customer service rep, but I got in. And there it was, my pension, 2 months deposited and drained. Grocery store charges that weren't mine. Online shopping I never ordered. Transfers to Kwang's joint account. I stared at the screen and felt nothing for a moment. Not anger, not betrayal. Just silence. Then gradually a hot wave of resolve crept through me. They had taken what I spent my life building, piece by piece, smiling, saying I was too tired, too forgetful, too old to worry about such things. And I, wanting to believe I was still loved, still needed, had let them. But love doesn't look like that. It doesn't feel like manipulation tucked inside caretaking. It doesn't use your weakness as an entry point for control. It doesn't shrink you so it can grow larger. I spent the next 2 days making quiet calls. First to the bank, reported the fraud. Then to the social worker I used to teach with back in the day, who now ran a center for seniors. Her voice cracked as she heard my name. "Miss Ngok, is it really you? I'm afraid I'm calling you not as an old colleague," I said, "but as one of your clients." She helped me contact a lawyer, arranged for a temporary senior shelter where I could stay after the temple. "We can help you take back financial control," she said. "You've got rights. Even if they're your children." Even if they're your children. That was the hardest truth. I sat with it in the temple garden under the frangipani tree, its blossoms pale and sweet-smelling. I remembered holding Kwang for the first time, his body so small, I was afraid I'd break him. His fingers curled around mine. I would have given my life for him then, but something had shifted. Somewhere along the way he'd learned to take without asking, and I had let him because I was afraid that if I asserted myself he would withdraw his love. I see it now. Love that demands your silence isn't love, it's debt, disguised as affection. And I was done being in debt. By the time Lynn texted again a new message, this one feigning concern, I was no longer the same woman she'd left on that bench. Hi, Me, we've been trying to call you. Kwang's worried. Can we meet? No apology. No acknowledgement of what happened. Just a soft pull back into the net. A calculated move cloaked in the language of care. I didn't reply. I simply forwarded the message to my lawyer and blocked the number. Later that night, as I tucked into bed at the shelter, I ran my fingers along the embroidered edge of the blanket. A volunteer had left it folded on my cot. It smelled of lavender and soap. I felt clean. New. Not because I had a plan, not because I had won, but because for the first time in years, I had chosen myself. Not the mother version of me, not the quiet, obedient elder, not the one who smiled to keep the peace. Just me. I'd like to tell you healing came all at once. That reclaiming myself was like flicking on a light switch, and suddenly the room was warm, filled with truth and peace. But healing is slower. It doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in the quiet. It comes in learning how to walk again, not just with a cane and careful steps, but with confidence. With a sense that each step belongs to you. At the shelter, I kept to myself at first. Most of the other residents were like me, people who had worked hard their entire lives only to find themselves invisible when their usefulness expired. I met a woman named Mrs. Dung, who used to be a tailor. Her children took her apartment, said they'd keep her close after her stroke. Close meant in the basement near the laundry machine with no window. She'd gotten out too. We would sit together in the small garden after breakfast, pruning dead leaves, sipping weak coffee from chipped mugs. There was comfort in the companionship, not needy, not overbearing. Just presence. One morning, I received a letter from the bank. The investigation into the misappropriated funds had concluded. Kwang's name was on several unauthorized transactions. Because I was declared mentally competent, and there was no written consent to those transfers, the bank restored a portion of my funds and froze the joint account. They asked if I wanted to pursue charges, but I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. I met with the lawyer, a kind young man who reminded me of a former student, all sharp elbows and earnest eyebrows, and we crafted a legal document that removed Kwang and Lin from any access to my accounts. We updated my will, assigned a new power of attorney to a legal advisor from the senior center, and removed their names from every official form I could think of. I didn't send a copy to them. They'd know soon enough. One afternoon, as the monsoon rains rolled in thick curtains of water clapping against the shelter's tin roof, I went to the mirror. I don't often look at myself for long anymore, but that day I did. I studied the deep lines etched into my skin, the silver streaks in my hair, the softness sagging around my jaw. There was no shame. There was history. These hands raised a child. These eyes saw war and peace, birth and burial. This body carried grief and still stood. I hadn't been abandoned. I had walked away. There is a difference. By the third week, I began volunteering again. The center needed help with literacy for older residents, especially women who had never learned to read, because their lives had been too full of work babies' survival. I taught them the alphabet slowly, patiently, the way I had decades ago. Watching a woman in her 60s write her own name for the first time, trembling hand-proud tear lit something inside me. I was useful again. No, not just useful. I was whole. One evening, a young woman knocked on my door at the shelter. She was from a local NGO that placed seniors in part-time homestay roles, sort of like being a grandmother for hire. Some families needed help watching children preparing light meals. In return, the elders received a room, a stipend, and most importantly, respect. We had a family request someone with a teaching background, she said. Their little girl is shy, has trouble with words. We thought of you. It wasn't charity, it was purpose. I moved into the small home of a widowed man and his daughter, Leanne. She was 7 with a stutter that made her go silent in groups. But when we sat together with picture books and finger puppets, she spoke slowly, softly. Her father watched from the kitchen, eyes wide, as his daughter finally finished a full sentence without disappearing behind her own voice. He thanked me every evening, not with flowers or fanfare, just a quiet nod, a plate of warm food, and once a silk scarf, he said, belonged to his mother. I think she would have liked you, he said. I think I would have liked her too. Sometimes when I lay down at night in my small clean room in the rear of that modest home, I imagine my old apartment. The one I sold when Kwang convinced me I shouldn't live alone at my age. I remember the blue curtains that fluttered in the afternoon breeze, the narrow balcony where I used to grow bougainvillea. It was a quiet place, filled with small joys, like the rickety fan that clicked in the heat, or the tiny radio that played love songs from the 70s while I folded laundry. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And more than anything else, I miss that feeling of ownership. Not of things, but of space, of time, of being the captain of my own breath. Here in this new house, I wasn't alone, but I was free. Leanne had taken to calling me Bangoai, though I told her I wasn't her real grandmother. She smiled and said, "But you're my book, Grandma." That was enough for me. Every afternoon after her school, we sat on the floor with picture dictionaries and word cards. When she mispronounced a word, she'd scrunch her nose and giggle, and I'd pretend to be a confused puppet owl. What is hippopotamus? She'd laugh so hard she couldn't breathe. The laughter filled the corners of the house, and something inside me uncurled a little more each time. Her father Tuan was kind in the quiet way only people who have known grief can be. He'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago and spoke of her rarely but with warmth. We didn't talk much about the past. But sometimes over shared bowls of soup, he'd mention things in passing, how she used to hum while chopping vegetables, or how she loved the smell of rain on asphalt. I'd nod, sip my tea, and let the silence between us be a soft bridge rather than a chasm. One night, Leanne had a school performance, a poetry recital. She'd practiced her part with me for weeks, a few lines from a children's verse about mooncakes and lanterns. Her stutter had all but disappeared when she read now, but she was still shy about crowds. As the curtain rose, her eyes scanned the audience until they found me. I gave her a small, firm nod. "You're here. I see you," she began. Her voice trembled at first, then grew steady like a kite learning to catch the wind. Tuan's eyes glistened as he clapped beside me. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. That night, after Leanne had gone to bed, he brought out a tin of tea, old worn, probably saved for special occasions. "She wouldn't have made it through that without you," he said softly. "She would have," I replied. But maybe it would have taken a little longer. He smiled. You never said why you left your son's house, he added gently. I paused. Not because I didn't have words, I had too many. But I picked the truest one. Because I remembered I was still a person. He didn't ask more. Instead, he poured the tea into 2 ceramic cups, set them between us, and said, "To remembering." I raised my cup. To remembering, I echoed. Some days I still get calls from unknown numbers. Once I answered. It was Kwang. His voice was careful, dressed in gilt that had been pressed and ironed flat. Ma, I've been thinking. Maybe we rush things. Lynn's been seeing someone to help her manage stress. Things were hard for us, too. I listened for a moment. Then I interrupted. I don't want to rehash it. I just want you to know I'm safe. And I hope you'll raise your children better than you treated your mother. He was quiet for a long time. Then he whispered, I'm sorry. I ended the call after that. Not in anger, just with a calm finality, like closing a drawer that's already empty. Weeks passed. Seasons shifted. The jasmine in the backyard bloomed and bloomed again. I turned 72 with little fanfare, and it was enough. Leon made me a card that said, You are not old. You are ancient like the moon. I laughed for 5 full minutes. At night, I sometimes sit by the window and watch the stars. I think of all the women I knew who never got their voice back, who withered in someone else's house eating spoonfuls of guilt instead of rice, who gave everything and asked for so little only to be told even that was too much. But I am not one of them, not anymore. The seasons rolled by in quiet ceremony. Rain swept the streets clean of dust, and the warm winds of summer brought with them the scent of jackfruit and grilled corn from vendors down the road. In those rhythms, I found a kind of healing the hospital couldn't offer, and neither could therapy nor temples. It was the healing that came from being useful again, from being allowed to exist in someone's story, not as a burden but as a beacon. Leanne and I continued our afternoon rituals. She was learning to write stories now. One day she handed me a short piece she titled, The Girl at the Old Tree. In it, a lonely girl finds a bent, wrinkled tree in the forest. No one plays near it because it looks too broken to matter. But the girl sits beneath it every day and slowly learns that it knows the names of all the birds, the secrets of the seasons, and how to listen to the wind. I read it 3 times before I could speak. You wrote this? I asked, voice thin. She nodded shyly. You're the tree. It didn't feel like an insult. It felt like the highest kind of love. Later that evening, I sat with her story pressed to my chest and realized this is how dignity returns. Not through loud declarations, but in how someone sees you. In how they let you be whole, not perfect, not young, not always strong, but fully there. One morning, Tuan handed me an envelope. It's from Kwang, he said, not meeting my eyes. I took it heart steady. Inside was a letter. Handwritten, sloppy, unsure. Ma, I don't know how to undo what I did. I don't think I can. Lynn and I, we were overwhelmed, scared. But that doesn't excuse anything. What we did to you, that wasn't care. That was control. You didn't deserve that. You never did. I've started returning the money to the account. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you I see it now. All of it. I miss you. I hope you're okay. I hope you're free. Your son Kwang. I read the letter once. Then I folded it back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer under a stack of Leon's drawings. not as a gesture of rejection, but as a decision. Some stories are not meant to be re-entered. They are meant to be remembered and moved on from. I didn't write back. I did, however, go to the bank one more time. The money had begun to return bit by bit, just as he'd said. Not that I needed it. I lived simply, ate modestly, and had more than enough. But the money was mine. It had always been mine. And reclaiming it wasn't about greed. It was about naming the truth that what was taken from me had value, and so did I. Sometimes at night I still feel the old ache in my hip. I imagine that pain as a kind of companion, not cruel, just honest. It reminds me that my body has survived things my heart is still learning to process. The pain will never vanish, but neither will I. And in this house I am not watched like a fragile thing. I am not handled like glass. I am consulted, invited, welcomed. On weekends I sit with Tuan while he cooks. We talk about mundane things, prices at the market, how fast the kids grow, how the electricity always seems to flicker during storms. Sometimes he plays old songs on the radio. Occasionally our hands brush when reaching for the same spice, and we smile without the need to explain. We are not building something grand. We are mending, thread by thread. I remember once asking my own mother when I was young and impatient, "How do you know when you've grown up?" She had smiled and said, "When you stop asking others to tell you who you are." It took me 71 years to understand what she meant. Now, when I look in the mirror, I know who I am. I do not need my son's approval. I do not need society's soft pitying glances or Lynn's passive smile at family gatherings. I do not even need the old apartment, the one with the blue curtains. What I need is what I have now. A name, a voice, a life that answers to no one's script. A girl calls me Grandma Tree. A man brews me tea without agenda. A mirror shows me someone whole. That is enough. That is more than enough.